What if I told you that hidden in the dusty corners of Genesis lies the origin story of a people so hated by God that he swore to erase their very name from existence? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally erased from the earth. The Amalekites, descendants of Abraham's own family, somehow crossed a line so terrible that the God of infinite mercy declared eternal war against them. But here's what haunts biblical scholars. What exactly did they do? Why were they, out of all ancient peoples, singled out for this unprecedented divine fury? Was it just one attack in the desert? Or was there something darker, something prophetic about their very existence? Even stranger, King Saul lost his throne for not destroying them completely. A young shepherd named David fought them. The prophet Samuel personally executed their king, and yet they kept surviving, kept reappearing, like a curse that refused to die. Their story reads like a supernatural thriller woven through centuries of biblical history. So who were these shadow warriors of the wilderness? What secret did they carry that made them enemies of heaven itself? And here's the most chilling question of all. Did God's ancient prophecy ever truly come to pass? Let's uncover the mystery. The story begins with two brothers fighting even before they were born, inside Rebekah's womb. Jacob and Esau struggled against each other, and when the time came for delivery, Esau emerged first, covered in red hair. His brother Jacob came out right behind him, gripping Esau's heel. From that moment, their lives would be marked by conflict and competition. Esau grew into a skilled hunter, a man of the open fields who loved the wilderness. His father Isaac favored him because he enjoyed the wild game Esau brought home. But one day, after returning from the field exhausted and famished, Esau made a choice that would alter the course of history. Genesis chapter 25 verse 29 tells us, once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob saw an opportunity. He told his brother, "Sell me your birthright now." The birthright was everything. It meant a double portion of the inheritance, the leadership of the family, and the spiritual blessing that passed from father to firstborn son. But Esau, thinking only of his immediate hunger, responded with shocking carelessness. Genesis 25 verses 32 through 34 records his words, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" So he swore an oath and sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew and some bread. The passage concludes with a devastating assessment. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Years later, when Isaac grew old and his eyes became dim, he decided to bless Esau before he died. But Rebekah overheard the plan and helped Jacob deceive his father by disguising himself as Esau. When Isaac touched Jacob's hands, which were covered with goatskins to feel hairy like Esau's, he was fooled. Jacob received the blessing meant for his brother. When Esau discovered what had happened, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, as Genesis 27 verse 34 describes it. He begged his father, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" But Isaac had already given the primary blessing to Jacob. The only blessing left for Esau was one of struggle. Genesis 27 verses 39 and 40 record Isaac's words to his elder son, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother, but when you grow restless you shall break his yoke from your neck." Esau's heart filled with murderous rage toward Jacob. He plotted to kill his brother as soon as their father died. But Rebekah caught wind of the plan and sent Jacob away to her brother Laban in Haran. Esau was left behind, bitter and rejected. In his anger, and perhaps as an act of further rebellion against his parents, Esau took wives from the Canaanites and also from the family of Ishmael. Genesis 36 verse 2 names them. Esau took his wives from the Canaanites, Adah, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, Oholibamah, the daughter of Anah, the daughter of Zibeon the Hivite. These marriages were a grief to Isaac and Rebekah, but Esau had already set his course. Eventually, Esau moved away from Canaan entirely. He took his wives, his children, all his livestock, and all the property he had acquired, and went to live in the hill country of Seir, away from his brother Jacob. Genesis 36 verse 8 states simply, "So Esau settled in the hill country of Seir." Esau is Edom. This was the beginning of the Edomite nation, and from this line would come the Amalekites. Among all of Esau's sons, one stood above the rest in terms of birthright and authority. His name was Eliphaz, and he was born to Adah, one of Esau's wives. Genesis 36 verse 4 records this. Adah bore to Esau Eliphaz. Being the firstborn son of Esau meant that Eliphaz inherited the leadership position within the growing Edomite clan, even though his father had once carelessly thrown away his own birthright. Eliphaz became a chief among his people. The Bible lists him prominently among the chiefs of Edom in Genesis 36 verse 15. These are the chiefs of the sons of Esau, the sons of Eliphaz, the firstborn of Esau, the chiefs Teman, Omar, Zepho, Kenaz. His sons would each become chiefs in their own right, establishing territorial domains and family lines that would spread throughout the region of Seir. The position Eliphaz held was not merely honorary. As the firstborn, he was the primary heir of Esau's accumulated wealth, which included vast flocks and herds. He was also the keeper of family traditions and the one who would pass down the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Esau to the next generation. His authority extended over his brothers and their families, making him the patriarch of the next generation after Esau. But Eliphaz's household included more than just his wives. Like many men of wealth and status in the ancient world, he also had concubines, women of lesser status than wives, but still part of his household. And it would be through one of these concubines that a lineage would emerge that would trouble Israel for centuries to come. The woman's name was Timnah, and her story adds an intriguing layer to the origin of the Amalekites. Genesis 36 verse 12 introduces her briefly but significantly. Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. She bore Amalek to Eliphaz. This single verse contains the seed of centuries of conflict. But who was Timnah? The Bible gives us more information about her background in Genesis 36 verse 22, where we learn that she was the sister of Lotan. Lotan was a chief among the Horites, the people who inhabited the land of Seir before Esau and his descendants arrived. The Horites were the original inhabitants of that mountainous region, and they had their own established society with chiefs and territories. This detail reveals something important. Timnah was not from Esau's family line at all. She came from the indigenous population of the land. Her connection to Eliphaz represented a blending of the incoming Edomite people with the existing Horite inhabitants. Whether she became Eliphaz's concubine through arrangement, conquest, or some other means, the text doesn't specify. What matters is that this union brought together two different peoples. As a concubine, rather than a full wife, Timnah's status was lower. Her children would be recognized as part of Eliphaz's household, but they wouldn't have the same standing as the children born to his wives. This social distinction would play a role in how her son's descendants developed their identity. Not fully integrated into the main Edomite line, but not entirely separate either. The name Timnah itself appears elsewhere in Edomite genealogies, suggesting it was a significant name among the Horites. Her position, though secondary in Eliphaz's household, connected two peoples and two cultures. Through her, the blood of the original inhabitants of Seir mixed with the blood of Abraham's line through Esau. This mixing would produce a son whose descendants would become known throughout the ancient world. Timnah bore a son to Eliphaz, and they named him Amalek. Genesis 36 verse 12 states it plainly. She bore Amalek to Eliphaz. These are the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. This simple statement introduces a name that would become infamous in biblical history. Amalek was Esau's grandson through Eliphaz, making him Isaac's great-grandson and Abraham's great-great-grandson. The blood of the patriarchs ran through his veins. He was part of the covenant family, connected by direct lineage to the promises God had made to Abraham. Yet his descendants would become the embodiment of opposition to God's chosen people, Israel. The name Amalek appears in the genealogical records alongside his cousins, the other sons and grandsons of Esau. But something different happened with Amalek's line. While most of Esau's descendants remained integrated as Edomites, identifying primarily with the nation of Edom, Amalek's descendants formed their own distinct identity. They became known not as Edomites, but as Amalekites, a separate people group with their own territory and culture. Genesis 36 verse 16 lists Amalek among the chiefs. These are the chiefs of the sons of Esau, the sons of Eliphaz, the firstborn of Esau, the chiefs Teman, Omar, Zepho, Kenaz, Korah, Gatam, and Amalek. These are the chiefs of Eliphaz in the land of Edom. These are the sons of Ada. Notice that Amalek is listed among the chiefs, indicating he achieved a position of leadership and established his own domain. But unlike his uncles and cousins, who maintained their identity as Edomites dwelling in Mount Seir, Amalek's descendants migrated and established themselves in different territory. They moved into the Negev wilderness and the areas south of Canaan, creating distance between themselves and the main Edomite population. This geographical separation reinforced their developing separate identity. Why did this separation occur? The Bible doesn't give us explicit reasons, but Amalek's status as the son of a concubine rather than a full wife may have played a role. Perhaps there were inheritance disputes or social tensions that made it advantageous for his line to establish their own territory rather than compete for position within the main Edomite structure. Whatever the reasons, the result was clear. Amalek became the father not just of a family, but of a distinct people. The Amalekites made their home in some of the harshest territory in the ancient Near East. They settled primarily in the Negev, the desert region that forms the southern part of what would become Israel's territory. This was not lush farmland or territory with abundant water. It was a wilderness of rock and sand, scorching hot during the day and cold at night, where survival required toughness and intimate knowledge of the land. The region they inhabited stretched across a vast area. 1 Samuel 15 verse 7 describes the extent of their territory. And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. This indicates that Amalekite territory extended from Havilah in the east all the way to Shur, near the border of Egypt in the west. They controlled a significant portion of the Sinai Peninsula and the Negev wilderness. This positioning was strategic, whether intentionally or not. The Amalekites sat astride important trade routes that connected Egypt with the lands to the north and east. Caravans traveling between Africa and Asia had to pass through or near Amalekite territory. This gave the Amalekites opportunities for trade, but also for raiding. The control of desert water sources became crucial to their power, as travelers had to know where to find water or perish in the wilderness. Numbers 13 verse 29 describes the territorial layout when the Israelite spies scouted the promised land. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. The Amalekites were recognized as the people of the southern wilderness, distinct from the other peoples who inhabited the various regions of Canaan. The harsh environment shaped the Amalekite way of life. They couldn't rely on farming in most of their territory because of the lack of water and arable soil. Instead, they became pastoralists, moving their flocks and herds to wherever seasonal rains created temporary grazing. They lived in tents rather than building permanent cities, always ready to move to the next water source or pasture. This nomadic lifestyle in the desert made them hardy and resilient. They knew how to survive where others would perish. They could travel quickly across terrain that would slow down armies from the settled lands. Their knowledge of the desert was their greatest asset, allowing them to appear suddenly, strike, and disappear back into the wilderness before their enemies could mount an effective response. The Amalekites organized themselves differently from the settled kingdoms that surrounded them. They didn't have a single capital city or a unified central government in their early history. Instead, they functioned as a confederation of tribes, each led by its own chief or leader. This structure was common among nomadic peoples of the ancient Near East, but the Amalekites maintained it for centuries. The Bible refers to Amalekite leaders as chiefs, similar to how Edomite leaders were designated. Genesis 36 verse 16 includes Amalek in the list of chiefs. These are the chiefs of the sons of Esau. This title indicated someone who led a clan or extended family group, controlling territory and resources, and commanding warriors in times of conflict. These chiefs passed their authority down through family lines. A chief's sons would typically inherit leadership roles, creating dynasties within each tribal segment. However, the system also allowed for some flexibility. A particularly capable warrior or respected elder could rise to prominence even without being the firstborn son of the previous chief. The tribal structure gave the Amalekites certain advantages. They could coordinate for large-scale raids or wars when needed, bringing together warriors from multiple tribes. But they could also operate independently, with individual tribes conducting their own raids and governing their own affairs. This flexibility made them difficult to defeat completely, because destroying one group didn't eliminate the others. Decision-making in such a system typically happened through councils of chiefs. When major decisions needed to be made, whether to go to war, where to migrate, how to respond to threats, the chiefs would gather and deliberate. Consensus was important, though the most powerful chiefs would naturally have more influence in these discussions. Later in their history, the Amalekites did have kings. 1 Samuel 15 verse 8 mentions Agag, the king of the Amalekites. But even when they had kings, the tribal structure remained important. The king's authority rested on the support of the tribal chiefs, and these chiefs maintained significant autonomy in their own territories. This organizational structure reflected their nomadic lifestyle. A centralized kingdom requires fixed territory, infrastructure, and institutions. But the Amalekites moved with their herds, lived in tents, and valued mobility. Their chiefs were battle leaders and judges, not bureaucrats sitting in palaces. Their law was customary and oral, passed down through generations rather than written in codes and enforced by courts. Something puzzling appears in the biblical text when we look carefully at when the Amalekites are first mentioned. Long before the genealogical record of Amalek's birth in Genesis 36, the name Amalekites shows up in an earlier story. Genesis 14, verse 7 describes a military campaign by a coalition of eastern kings in the time of Abraham. Then they turned back and came to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. This reference is puzzling because it occurs before Amalek was even born. Abraham was still alive when these events took place, yet the text speaks of the country of the Amalekites, as if they were already an established people with recognized territory. How can this be? This is what scholars call an anachronism, when later names or information are used to describe earlier times. The writer of Genesis, recording the story long after these events occurred, used the name that readers in his own time would recognize. By the time Genesis was written down in its final form, the The Amalekites were so well known that referring to that southern desert region as the country of the Amalekites immediately told readers where the action took place. It's similar to how we might say the French fought the English at Hastings, even though France and England weren't called by those names yet in 1066. The writer uses familiar geographical designations to help readers understand the location, even though those designations came later. This early reference does tell us something important. The region that would become associated with the Amalekites was already significant in Abraham's time. It was territory worth fighting over, with resources and strategic value. When Amalek's descendants eventually settled there, they were moving into an area with a long history. Another early reference appears in the story of Balaam in Numbers 24. When Balaam looked out and saw the Amalekites, he uttered a prophecy. Numbers 24 verse 20 records, "Then he looked on Amalek and took up his discourse and said, Amalek was the first among the nations, but its end shall be utter destruction." The phrase, "first among the nations," is interesting. It could mean they were the first to attack Israel, or it could refer to their antiquity and prominence among the peoples of the region. These references, both the anachronistic one in Genesis 14 and the prophetic one in Numbers 24, show that the Amalekites occupied a significant place in Israel's historical memory. They weren't just another neighboring tribe. Their name carried weight and meaning. Even when writing about times before the Amalekites existed, biblical writers used their name as a geographical marker because it communicated clearly to their audience. As Amalek's descendants multiplied and spread across the Negev and Sinai wilderness, they developed a distinct culture that set them apart from both their Edomite relatives and the other peoples of the region. This wasn't just about where they lived or how they were organized politically. It was about who they were as a people. The Amalekites became known throughout the ancient Near East as fierce warriors and raiders. Their reputation was built on their military capabilities and their willingness to attack targets that others might avoid. Living in the desert had made them tough, but they chose to channel that toughness into aggression. They didn't build monuments or cities that archaeologists could later excavate. They didn't create literature or art that survived the centuries. Their legacy was written in the memories of the peoples they raided. Their nomadic lifestyle meant they accumulated wealth differently from settled peoples. Instead of owning land and buildings, their wealth consisted of livestock, portable goods, and what they could take from others. Raiding wasn't just occasional warfare for them. It was part of their economic system. Caravans crossing the desert, settlements on the edges of the wilderness, even refugees and migrants passing through their territory, all were potential targets. This raiding culture shaped their values and their identity. They prized strength, courage, and skill in battle. Their young men learned to fight from childhood, trained in the use of sword and bow. They learned to move quickly across the desert, to track prey both animal and human, to strike without warning and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The Amalekites also developed a reputation for a particular kind of ruthlessness. As we'll see in later events, they didn't follow the normal customs of warfare that other peoples observed. They attacked the weak and vulnerable without hesitation. This wasn't considered shameful in their culture. It was practical. Why fight strong, armed warriors when you could take what you needed from those who couldn't resist? Their connection to the Edomites remained, but it grew more distant with each generation. They shared common ancestry through Esau and probably maintained some trade relationships and occasional cooperation, but the Amalekites saw themselves as distinct. They had their own chiefs, their own territory, their own way of life. When biblical writers listed the peoples of the region, the Amalekites and Edomites were named separately, recognized as different nations. Language likely played a role in this separate identity. While we don't have records of the Amalekite language, They probably spoke a dialect related to Edomite and other Semitic languages of the region, but with its own distinctive features developed during their time in the wilderness. Names, expressions, and vocabulary specific to desert life would have reinforced their sense of being a unique people. Religious practices also distinguished them. As descendants of Esau, they would have known the stories of Abraham and Isaac, but they didn't worship Abraham's God. Like the Edomites and other peoples descended from Abraham's line but outside the covenant, the Amalekites followed other gods. The Bible doesn't detail their religious practices, but they clearly didn't share Israel's faith or acknowledge Israel's God as supreme. By the time Israel emerged from Egypt centuries after Amalek's birth, the Amalekites had become a fully established people with a clear identity. They controlled significant territory, had their own military traditions, and were recognized by all the surrounding peoples as a distinct nation. They had transformed from being merely descendants of Esau's grandson into the Amalekites, a people whose name would soon be written into history through an act that would define them forever in Israel's memory. The Israelites had just experienced the most dramatic rescue in human history. They had watched 10 plagues devastate Egypt while they remained untouched. They had seen the Red Sea split open before them, walked through on dry ground, and witnessed the Egyptian army drown behind them. God had delivered them with mighty power, and they were now free people heading toward the land promised to their ancestor Abraham. But freedom didn't mean ease. The wilderness between Egypt and Canaan was brutal and unforgiving. Exodus 15, verse 22, describes their first challenge after crossing the sea. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. On 3 days without water in the desert heat. When they finally found water at Marah, it was bitter and undrinkable. The people grumbled, and God showed Moses how to make the water sweet. From there they traveled to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, a beautiful oasis where they could rest. But they couldn't stay. Exodus 16 verse 1 records, "They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt." In this wilderness, hunger gripped them. The people complained bitterly against Moses and Aaron, saying they wished they had died in Egypt, where at least they had food. God responded by sending quail in the evening and manna in the morning, bread from heaven that would sustain them throughout their wilderness journey. The congregation moved from place to place as God directed. Exodus 17 verse 1 tells us, "All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink." Again, the problem of water. Again, the people complained. They quarreled with Moses, demanding water and even questioning whether God was truly with them. Moses cried out to God, and the Lord told him to take his staff and strike a rock at Horeb. Exodus 17 verses 5 and 6 record God's instructions. "Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." Moses did as commanded, and water gushed from the rock. The place was named Massah and Meribah because of the testing and quarreling that happened there. This was Israel's condition at Rephidim. They were a massive group of men, women, and children. Exodus 12 verse 37 indicates there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. They were not an army. They were former slaves with no military training, no weapon stockpiles, no battle formations or strategies. They had elderly people who moved slowly, sick people who struggled to keep up, mothers carrying infants, and young children who tired easily on long marches. The people were organized into families and tribes, but they had no unified military command structure. They moved as a civilian population with all the vulnerabilities that entailed. Their strength was not in their own power, but in God's presence with them, manifested in the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that guided their journey. They were exhausted from the constant travel through harsh terrain. They were still adjusting to their freedom after generations of slavery. They had just dealt with the crisis of no water, and their faith was shaky. They had literally just questioned whether God was among them. They were physically depleted, emotionally drained, and spiritually fragile. This was the moment the Amalekites chose to attack. The attack came without warning and without justification. Exodus 17 verse 8 records it simply, "Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim." There was no territorial dispute. Israel wasn't invading Amalekite land or threatening their resources. The Israelites were passing through the wilderness, following the guidance of their God. But the Amalekites saw an opportunity and took it. The method of attack revealed the character of the Amalekites. They didn't challenge Israel's fighting men to open battle. They didn't send envoys or make demands. Instead, they targeted the most vulnerable. Deuteronomy 25 verse 17 and 18 provides crucial details about this attack that Exodus doesn't include. "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God." The phrase "cut off your tail" is a military expression meaning they attacked from the rear. The people at the back of Israel's column were the stragglers, those who couldn't keep pace with the main group. These would be the elderly whose legs gave out after hours of walking, the sick and injured who struggled to move at all, parents burdened with small children who needed to be carried, the weak and exhausted who simply had nothing left to give. These people posed no threat to the Amalekites. They had no ability to fight back effectively. Attacking them required no courage, no military skill. It was pure predation, striking at defenseless victims who couldn't resist. And the text tells us explicitly that the Amalekites did not fear God. They showed no reverence for the miraculous events surrounding Israel's exodus. They didn't care that this people had just been delivered by the God who had crushed Egypt. They saw vulnerability and exploited it without hesitation or conscience. The attack forced Moses and the people to respond. They couldn't ignore this assault. The Amalekites had drawn blood, had killed Israelites, and showed every intention of continuing their attacks. If Israel didn't defend themselves, the Amalekites would pick them apart piece by piece, killing the weak and taking whatever they wanted. The people who had just been delivered from slavery now faced a different kind of enemy, not an empire holding them captive, but desert raiders determined to destroy them in the wilderness. Moses acted immediately. He understood that while God would fight for Israel, the people also needed to defend themselves. This wasn't a time for panic or paralysis. It was time to organize a defense and trust God for victory. Exodus 17 verse 9 records Moses' instructions. "So Moses said to Joshua, 'Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand.'" This is the first time Joshua appears in the biblical narrative. His full name was Hoshea, but Moses had renamed him Joshua, which means "the Lord saves." He was from the tribe of Ephraim, the son of Nun. Before this moment, Joshua is never mentioned. We don't know what he did in Egypt or during the journey so far, but Moses chose him for this critical task, indicating that Joshua had already shown leadership qualities, courage, and faith that set him apart. Moses gave Joshua a difficult assignment. Choose fighting men from among the people. Remember, these were former slaves. They weren't trained soldiers. They didn't have military experience or battle-tested weapons. Joshua had to identify men who were physically capable, willing to fight, and brave enough to face a well-known warrior people like the Amalekites. He had to organize them into some kind of fighting force overnight, because Moses told him the battle would happen tomorrow. The command to choose for us men also suggests that not every Israelite male would fight. Some needed to stay back to protect the women, children, and elderly. Others might not be physically capable of combat. Joshua had to make quick decisions about who would serve in this first military action of Israel's nationhood. Moses himself would not fight in the valley. His role was different, but equally crucial. He would stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in his hand. This was the same staff that had turned into a serpent before Pharaoh, the same staff that had been raised over the Nile to turn it to blood, the same staff that had parted the Red Sea and struck the rock to bring forth water. It was a symbol of God's power working through Moses, a visible reminder that the Lord fought for his people. The strategy Moses outlined combined human action with divine intervention. Joshua and the men would do the fighting on the ground. They would swing the swords, shoot the arrows, engage the enemy face to face. But Moses would stand above the battle with the staff raised, interceding with God, maintaining the spiritual connection that would determine the outcome. Both elements were necessary. Neither alone would be sufficient. Joshua accepted the assignment without recorded complaint or hesitation. Exodus 17 verse 10 states simply, "So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill." This was Joshua's introduction to leadership and to warfare. It was his first test in a role that would ultimately lead to him becoming Moses' successor and the one who would lead Israel into the promised land. But that was still decades in the future. Right now, he was a man given an impossible task and a single day to prepare for it. The battle began at dawn. Joshua led the hastily assembled Israelite fighters down into the valley where the Amalekites waited. These were not seasoned warriors on Israel's side. They were farmers and laborers, men who had spent their lives making bricks in Egypt, now facing desert raiders who had grown up with weapons in their hands. But they fought because they had to, because their families depended on them, and because God had called them to it. Meanwhile, Moses climbed to the top of the hill overlooking the battlefield, accompanied by Aaron and Hur. Aaron was Moses' brother, the one who had spoken for Moses before Pharaoh and served as high priest. Hur was a leader among the people, though the Bible gives us few details about him. Some traditions identify him as the husband of Miriam, Moses' sister, though the text doesn't confirm this. What matters is that these three men stood together on the hilltop while Joshua and his fighters engaged the enemy below. Exodus 17 verse 11 describes what happened next. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. The connection was immediate and obvious. When Moses raised the staff toward heaven, when his hands were lifted up, the Israelite fighters gained the advantage in the valley. They pushed the Amalekites back. They struck down their enemies. Victory seemed within reach, but when Moses' arms grew tired and he lowered his hands, the battle shifted. The Amalekites rallied. They drove the Israelites back. They gained ground and inflicted casualties. This was spiritual warfare made visible. The outcome of the battle didn't depend ultimately on military tactics, superior numbers, or better weapons. It depended on Moses' upraised hands, connecting earth to heaven, maintaining the flow of God's power into the human conflict below. The staff of God lifted high was like a prayer in physical form, an appeal to divine strength, an acknowledgement that the Lord was the true commander of Israel's forces. The Israelite soldiers could see Moses on the hilltop. When his hands were raised, they knew God was with them, and they fought with renewed courage and strength. When his hands dropped, they could see it, and doubt crept in. The physical reality of Moses' position directly affected the spiritual and emotional state of the fighters. This wasn't superstition or magic, it was the outward expression of dependence on God, made so concrete that everyone could see it and understand it. For the Amalekites, this phenomenon was probably invisible or incomprehensible. From their perspective, the battle simply ebbed and flowed in ways that made no logical sense. At times, the Israelites fought with unexpected skill and power. At other times, they seemed to weaken. The Amalekites had no framework for understanding that their fate was being determined by an old man's upraised arms on a distant hilltop and the God who responded to his intercession. The battle raged on through the morning and into the afternoon. Neither side gained a decisive advantage for hours. Men fought and fell, the clash of weapons, the shouts of warriors, the cries of the wounded filled the valley. But the ultimate issue was being decided not in the valley, but on the hilltop, where Moses stood with his arms extended toward heaven and the staff of God gripped in his hands. As the hours passed, Moses faced a physical crisis. Exodus 17 verse 12 explains, "But Moses' hands grew weary." This seems like a small problem until you consider what it meant for the battle. Every time his hands dropped, Israelites died. Every time his arms fell, the Amalekites gained ground. But Moses was an old man. He was 80 years old when he confronted Pharaoh, and now he had been leading Israel through the wilderness for months. Holding his arms up with a heavy staff for hours was physically impossible. The verse continues, "So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it." Aaron and Hur saw the problem immediately. Moses couldn't keep standing. His legs were giving out along with his arms, so they found a stone large enough for him to sit on. This wasn't a throne or a comfortable seat, it was a rock. But it allowed Moses to remain in position without completely collapsing from exhaustion. He could sit and continue his role in the battle, but sitting helped only partially. His arms still had to be raised, and they were still getting tired. That's when Aaron and Hur stepped into roles that would be remembered forever. The verse continues, "While Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, so his hands were steady until the going down of the sun." These two men positioned themselves on either side of Moses and physically held his arms up. When Moses no longer had the strength to keep his own hands raised, his brother and his companion became his strength. They supported his arms, keeping them elevated and steady, maintaining the connection to heaven that the battle required. This image became one of the most powerful pictures of community and support in all of Scripture. Moses couldn't do it alone. Even Moses, the great leader, the man who spoke with God face to face, needed help. He needed people beside him literally holding him up when his own strength failed. And Aaron and Hur didn't try to take over his role or push him aside. They didn't say, "Moses, you're too weak, let us handle this." They came alongside and made it possible for Moses to continue doing what only he could do. The verse says, "His hands were steady until the going down of the sun." This means they stood there for hours, through the heat of the day, through their own exhaustion and discomfort, without wavering. They committed completely to this one task, keeping Moses' hands raised. Their own arms must have ached. Their backs must have hurt from the awkward position. But they didn't quit. They didn't take breaks. They held steady because they understood that Moses' raised hands meant victory and lowered hands meant defeat. Their faithfulness in this supporting role was as critical as Joshua's courage in the valley below. Exodus 17 verse 13 records the outcome. "And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword." The sustained intercessory position on the hilltop led to sustained victory in the valley. Joshua and his fighters completely defeated the Amalekite forces. It wasn't a narrow victory or a temporary repulsion of the attack. The text says Joshua overwhelmed them, a total crushing defeat. The Amalekites, who had attacked Israel's stragglers, were themselves struck down with the sword until their force was broken and scattered. After the battle ended and victory was secured, God spoke to Moses with a message that would echo through all of Israel's history. Exodus 17 verse 14 records, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven.'" This wasn't just a comment on the day's battle. This was a divine decree about the future of an entire people. The command to write it in a book meant this wasn't to be forgotten or treated as casual. It needed to be recorded permanently, preserved for future generations. Moses was to write it down so there would be an official written record of God's intention regarding Amalek. The written word would outlast human memory and ensure this decree was never lost. But God didn't stop with having it written. He specifically told Moses to recite it in the ears of Joshua. Joshua needed to hear this directly from Moses. He needed to understand that the battle he had just fought was not the end of the conflict with Amalek. It was the beginning of something much longer. Joshua would live to see more conflicts with the Amalekites, and he needed to know God's ultimate plan for them. This personal communication to Joshua also hinted at his future role as Moses' successor. He would need this knowledge for the responsibilities that lay ahead. The decree itself was absolute. "I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." The word utterly leaves no room for partial measures. God wasn't saying he would diminish them or reduce their power. He was declaring their complete erasure, not just their physical destruction, but the blotting out of their very memory, their name, their legacy, their place in history. They would cease to exist as a people, and eventually even the memory of them would fade from the earth. Why such a severe judgment? The answer lies in what they had done. They had attacked defenseless people without provocation. They had shown no fear of God, despite witnessing his mighty acts for Israel. They had struck at the weak and vulnerable, revealing a character devoid of mercy or honor. Their action at Rephidim was not just a military attack. It was an assault that revealed something deeply wrong at the core of their national character. Exodus 17 verse 16 adds another layer to this decree. "And he said, 'A hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation.'" This verse is somewhat difficult to translate from the Hebrew, but the message is clear. God himself declared war against Amalek, not just for this generation, but for all generations to come. This was not a temporary conflict that would be resolved through diplomacy or negotiation. This was a perpetual state of war between God and Amalek, lasting until the divine decree of total destruction was fulfilled. The phrase, "from generation to generation," meant that Israel's descendants would continue this conflict. It wouldn't be resolved quickly. The war with Amalek would span centuries, involving multiple generations of Israelites. Each generation would need to remember what Amalek had done and understand that the conflict continued until God's word was completely fulfilled. This divine vow set Amalek apart from all other enemies of Israel. Other nations might fight against Israel and later make peace. Other peoples might oppose God's plans and later be incorporated into his purposes. But Amalek received a special status as an enemy marked for ultimate destruction, a people against whom God himself had declared unending war. Their attack at Rephidim had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed and sealed their fate for all time. After receiving God's decree and recording it as commanded, Moses turned to building a memorial of the day's victory. Exodus 17 verse 15 tells us, "And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, 'The Lord is my banner.'" This altar served as a physical monument to mark what had happened at Rephidim, ensuring future generations would remember the battle and its supernatural nature. The name Moses gave the altar was deeply significant. In Hebrew, it was Yahweh Nissi, which translates literally as, "The Lord is my banner," or "The Lord is my standard." To understand why this name mattered, you have to understand what banners meant in ancient warfare. Armies carried banners or standards, large flags or poles with distinctive symbols, into battle. These served multiple purposes. Warriors rallied around their banner when the fighting got confusing. The banner showed where the commander was positioned. It served as a visible symbol of identity and authority. As long as the banner stood, the army knew they were still in the fight. By naming the altar, "The Lord is my banner," Moses declared that Israel's true rallying point was not a piece of cloth or a military symbol. It was God himself. The Lord was their standard, their symbol, their rally point in battle. When the fighting got difficult and confusing, they were to look to God. When they needed to know where their true commander was, they should look to heaven. Their identity and authority came not from earthly power, but from the God who fought for them. This name also reflected the reality of how the battle had been won. It wasn't Israel's military skill or superior numbers that brought victory. It was the presence and power of God, activated through Moses' upraised hands and the staff of God held high. The Lord had been their banner on that day, in the most literal sense. Moses, holding the staff aloft, had functioned exactly like a battle standard, and the spiritual reality it represented had determined the outcome. The altar itself was built from stones, as was customary. It would stand as a permanent marker at that location. Future travelers passing through Rephidim would see it and ask about it. Israelites would tell their children about the altar and why it was built. The story would be passed down. That's where the Amalekites attacked our ancestors, and that's where God gave them victory. That's where Moses' hands were held up all day, and that's where Joshua first led men into battle. That's where God declared perpetual war against Amalek. The altar connected the physical and spiritual realities of what had happened. Physically, it was stones piled up in the desert. Spiritually, it represented God's power, his protection of his people, and his eternal opposition to those who would attack the weak and defenseless. It was both a celebration of victory and a warning about ongoing conflict. It commemorated what God had done and pointed forward to what he had promised to do in the future. The events at Rephidim were not meant to be a one-time story that faded with those who experienced it. God explicitly commanded that this memory be preserved and transmitted to future generations. The writing of the decree, the recitation to Joshua, and the building of the altar all served this purpose. But the command to remember went even further, extending beyond the immediate aftermath of the battle. Deuteronomy 25, verses 17 through 19, given much later as Israel prepared to enter the Promised Land, repeats and expands the command to remember. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. The command, remember, in Hebrew carries more weight than casual recollection. It means to actively keep in mind, to deliberately recall, to make sure the knowledge doesn't fade. Israel was to remember what Amalek did, the cowardly attack on the weak, the lack of fear of God, the unprovoked violence. This wasn't about nursing hatred or seeking revenge for its own sake. It was about understanding the character of this enemy and recognizing the justice of God's decree against them. The timing mentioned in the Deuteronomy passage is significant. When the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, Israel was not to immediately pursue the total destruction of Amalek. They had other battles to fight first, other enemies to defeat, a land to conquer and settle. But once they had established themselves in the promised land, once they had rest and security, then they were to fulfill God's command regarding Amalek. The reckoning would come, but in God's timing. The final phrase is striking: "You shall not forget." After commanding them to remember, God adds this negative formulation: don't let this slip from your memory. Don't become complacent. Don't decide that enough time has passed and it doesn't matter anymore. The obligation to remember was permanent, binding on each generation until the decree was fulfilled. This command to remember and teach created a chain of transmission across the centuries. Parents would tell children what Amalek had done at Rephidim. Those children would grow up and tell their own children. The written record in Moses' book would be read and studied. The story would be repeated in the teaching of Israel's history. Each generation would learn that Amalek had attacked their ancestors when they were most vulnerable, that God had given victory that day through Moses' raised hands and Joshua's courage, and that God had decreed Amalek's eventual total destruction. The command ensured that centuries later, when King Saul would be told to completely destroy the Amalekites, he would understand why. When David would fight against Amalekite raiders, he would know the history. When the final remnant of Amalekites would be struck down in the days of King Hezekiah, the Israelites doing it would know they were fulfilling an ancient decree that traced back to this day at Rephidim. The memory preserved through generations would give context and meaning to all future conflicts with this enemy. Centuries passed after the battle at Rephidim. Israel had entered the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership and settled in the territory God had given them. But they fell into a destructive cycle that repeated throughout the period of the Judges. They would worship God, then turn to other gods, then face oppression, then cry out for deliverance. During one dark period, the Amalekites reappeared as a major threat, but this time they didn't act alone. Judges 6 verse 3 describes the coalition. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They had joined forces with the Midianites and eastern tribes to terrorize Israel. Their strategy was brutally effective. They waited until harvest time when crops were ripe and ready to gather. Judges 6 verse 4 explains, they would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel and no sheep or ox or donkey. They took everything and destroyed what they couldn't carry. Verse 5 adds, for they would come up with their livestock and their tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted, so that they laid waste the land as they came in. Like a locust swarm stripping everything, this coalition swept through Israel, consuming everything in their path. This oppression lasted 7 years. 7 consecutive seasons of planting, only to have everything stolen at harvest. Judges 6 verse 6 says, and Israel was brought very low because of Midian. The people were impoverished and desperate, hiding in mountain caves to protect what little they had. Finally, they cried out to God, and he prepared to raise up a deliverer named Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon while he was secretly threshing wheat in a winepress, hiding it from raiders. The angel greeted him. The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. Gideon responded with doubt, asking why they were suffering if God was with them. God gave him a commission. Judges 6 verse 14 records, and the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? After receiving confirmation through signs, Gideon sent messengers calling men to fight. 32,000 gathered, but God said the army was too large. If they won with that many, they'd credit their own strength. First, anyone afraid could leave. 22,000 went home. Then God reduced the force further through a drinking test, leaving only 300 men. God gave Gideon an unusual battle plan. Each man would carry a torch hidden in a clay jar and a trumpet. They would surround the enemy camp at night and, at Gideon's signal, break the jars, blow trumpets and shout. Judges 7 verses 19 through 22 describe what happened. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. The sudden eruption of light and sound from all sides threw the camp into chaos. God sent supernatural confusion, making them turn on each other. The vast army that had oppressed Israel for 7 years was routed by 300 men with torches and trumpets. Gideon pursued the fleeing kings and captured them, completely breaking the coalition's power. Generations later, Israel had transitioned to a kingdom under King Saul, but God's ancient decree against Amalek still stood unfulfilled. The prophet Samuel came to Saul with a direct message. 1 Samuel 15, verses 1 through 3 record, Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." This command was explicit. Saul was to devote everything to destruction, people and animals, without exception. Samuel reminded Saul why. God had noted what Amalek did at Rephidim centuries ago. Saul mobilized a massive force. 1 Samuel 15 verse 4 says, "So Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 men on foot, and 10,000 men of Judah. Before attacking, he warned the Canaanites to leave Amalekite territory because they had shown kindness to Israel during the Exodus." 1 Samuel 15 verse 7 states, "And Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt." The military victory was complete throughout their entire territory. The military campaign succeeded, but Saul didn't fully follow God's instructions. 1 Samuel 15 verse 8 records, "And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword." God had said not to spare anyone, but Saul kept King Agag alive. Verse 9 reveals the broader disobedience. "But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and of the oxen, and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. They kept the valuable livestock, and only destroyed what seemed worthless." God's response was immediate. Verses 10 and 11 say, "The word of the Lord came to Samuel, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments." And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. The next morning, Samuel found Saul at Gilgal. Verse 12 says, "Saul had set up a monument for himself, celebrating his victory, unaware of God's judgment." Saul greeted Samuel cheerfully. 1 Samuel 15 verse 13 records, "And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." Samuel immediately challenged this. Verse 14, "And Samuel said, What then is this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen that I hear?" The livestock sounds proved Saul's disobedience. Saul tried to justify himself in verse 15. Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction." He blamed the people and claimed religious motives. Samuel delivered one of Scripture's most important statements about obedience. 1 Samuel 15 verses 22 and 23. And Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." Religious activities cannot substitute for obedience. Saul's partial obedience with religious justification was rebellion equivalent to idolatry. The judgment was final. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. After hearing the judgment, Saul confessed his sin, but still made excuses. Samuel refused to return with him at first. When Saul grabbed Samuel's robe and it tore, Samuel said in verse 28, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." Then Samuel addressed the unfinished business of Agag. 1 Samuel 15 verse 32 says, "Then Samuel said, 'Bring here to me Agag, the king of the Amalekites.' And Agag came to him cheerfully. Agag said, 'Surely the bitterness of death is past.'" Agag thought he was safe. Verse 33 records, "And Samuel said, 'As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women.' And Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal." Samuel personally executed what Saul had failed to do, completing the judgment. Verse 34 concludes, "Then Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his house in Gibeah of Saul." The next verse adds, "And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul." Years later, David was fleeing from Saul and living in the Philistine town of Ziklag. From there, he raided Israel's enemies. 1 Samuel 27, verses 8 and 9 mention, "Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites." Then crisis struck. 1 Samuel 30 verse 1 describes, "Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire." Verse 2, "And taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great." The Amalekites had taken everyone, including David's 2 wives. Verse 4 says, "Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep." Verse 6 adds that his men talked of stoning him. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David inquired of God and received permission to pursue. Verses 7 and 8. "And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, 'Bring me the ephod.' So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?' He answered him, 'Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue.'" They found the Amalekite camp celebrating. Verses 16 and 17, "And when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled." Verse 18, "David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Everything was recovered." After David's victory, the Amalekites appear only sporadically. David became king, and 2 Samuel 8, verse 12 mentions he subdued Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek. a brief reference indicating campaigns against remaining groups. The final biblical reference comes during King Hezekiah's reign. 1 Chronicles 4 verses 42 and 43 record, "And some of them, 500 men of the Simeonites, went to Mount Seir, having as their leaders Pelatiah, Neariah, Rephaiah, and Uzziel, the sons of Ishi. And they defeated the remnant of the Amalekites who had escaped, and they have lived there to this day." A small expedition of 500 Simeonites found the remnant of the Amalekites who had escaped in Mount Seir and struck them down. This brief mention appears to fulfill God's decree. After this, the name Amalek disappears from biblical history. No more battles, no more raids, no more references as a living people. The divine vow made at Rephidim had been fulfilled. The Amalekites ceased to exist as a distinct people, their names surviving only in Scripture's historical records. If this deep dive into biblical history has opened your eyes to the extraordinary story of the Amalekites, a people born from Abraham's own bloodline, yet destined for divine judgment, then do two things right now. First, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss our next journey into the hidden stories and profound mysteries of Scripture. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful account of how God's justice unfolds across the centuries. Your share might be exactly what leads someone to discover the depths of God's word for the first time. The story of Amalek is finished, but your journey through the Bible's most fascinating accounts is just beginning. Subscribe now, and let's continue uncovering the truths that have been waiting for you to discover.